Hello, my name is James Bartolome, and I'm happy to be invited to participate in this NRCS seminar. When Joel asked me to do it, I was quite pleased because I'm aware of all the really good work that NRCS and its affiliate, the RCDs, have done. And the topic I'm going to cover, which is grazing and burning in California coastal rangelands, is one that is of a lot of interest, and I hope I'll be able to offer you some food for thought and information that will lead to a lively discussion next week. So I want to acknowledge that I've been assisted here considerably by Felix Ratcliffe and Kavi Motammed, who are both affiliates of the Range Ecology Lab at UC Berkeley, and there are others that I'm not going to mention that have provided information that I'll be talking about today. So to get going, here's the outline for the talk we'll be doing today. And first, I'm going to give a brief introduction to California rangelands and range science. And then I'm going to talk just very briefly about our range types in coastal San Diego County. And then I want to spend some time talking about how we can understand and predict processes on managed rangelands using some tools, which are models, ecological site descriptions, and their associated state and transition models. Don't be too worried. They can be very complicated or simple, and I'm going to try to aim for the understandable end of this. Then the next topic would be how effective grazing and/or burning are in promoting a diversity of biodiversity and other kinds of values of rangelands. Then I'll make some summary comments and give some acknowledgements and references. So start off with a definition of what the scope of our talk is. I'm going to be talking about both range and rangelands. These are terms that range managers use to define the subject of their study. And in this case, this picture is of range, because range is land grazed by livestock, and there's clearly grazing going on with this group of a nice Angus bull, a cow, and then a couple of smaller animals, and they're standing on rangeland. In this case, it's in the Tajon Hills at the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley. The vegetation there is a mix of natives and exotics. There's a native Amsinkia or fiddleneck in the picture. There's also a lot of exotic annual grasses. So this is range, which is land grazed by livestock. It also is range land. So if we kind of rangeland. This picture is this is Jerry's picture of coastal shrub grassland mosaics in San Diego County. So these types of southern coastal shrub, this is a vegetation dominated by woody plants. In this case, some of the plants in the foreground are laurel sumac. That's the bush in the foreground. In the background are some of the other common coastal shrub plants like coastal sage. And in the foreground is mostly annuals that are from the Mediterranean. These are annual grasses and forbs that were brought from the Mediterranean, mostly inadvertently. And so rangelands are defined worldwide as consisting of grasslands. We've got grasslands in the foreground. Savannas, which are a grassland with trees added. And savannas, the best ones to think about in South Coast area would be oak savannas. So live oak savannas are a type of rangeland. And then the other type, which is very extensive, are shrublands. So on the top of the hill, those shrublands are another type of rangeland. So the two terms that we'll use throughout this talk are rangeland, this general kind of land, and then range, which is land grazed by livestock. So ecological site definitions, This is a fundamental unit that is now part of modern range science. And it's simply defined as an assemblage of land units within a singular climate with similar topographic and soil characteristics that support similar potential vegetation and respond similarly to management. And this has been a very useful model for organizing information about rangelands. And it's similar and derived from the old term, which was called range site, which in California, there are very few new ecological site definitions. Mostly they've just taken the old range sites and renamed them ecological sites. And so they have a name, but then if you look them up, there's no content to them that's different from the old range sites. So when we were working on a range project at the Tejon Ranch in the Tehachapis, we worked with the NRCS on their range site concepts, but we developed our own. And we did that with cooperation of the NRCS, but they're somewhat different. So this is an example of an ecological site. And this is a graphical representation. So in this case, I'm going to talk about the one ecological site, which is the sandy alluvial flats that's down here at the bottom. That's at the bottom of the San Joaquin Valley. And then as you go up in elevation, you run through a whole series of other identifiable range sites. But let's just take a look at these sandy alluvial flats and see what we can do with them. So this is developing these sites required a lot of hard work by students and others on plots that we laid out through the Tejon Ranch. So this is a sandy alluvial flat in spring and being sampled by a field crew. And it's pretty typical of the kinds of things you see there. The main flowering plant are lupins. Those are really common. And they're in a matrix of exotic annual grasses of a variety of sorts. But this is a range site. And once you identify a range site, then you can describe it. But the importance of it is it can be used as a matrix for determining what's going to happen under different management conditions and climate conditions. And so you can build what's called a state and transition model, which in this case is just defining some boxes and then looking at how over time you might get a change into another type. So the one that we saw in the picture, we had this one where lupins were dominant, but that's not always the case. And so this arrow shows what might happen in terms of a transition, in which case you would have exotic annual grasses dominant with fewer lupins. And so we can develop some hypotheses about why this might happen. Some of the others over here here's native annual forbs characteristically abundant versus exotic annuals abundant. Those are transitions that can go back and forth. T1 is one of them and T2 is the other. These are all states and transitions that are based on sampling that we did over a series of years to find out exactly what was going on in the vegetation. We had some ideas about how these would work, but most of our ideas about the original states and transitions were later replaced by data-driven and hypothesis-driven models. So this is the most recent model. And it shows things like this arrow here shows that the exotic annual grass dominant type is one that's very stable because in many cases, it's just cycling internally with a few changes, which are called phase shifts within these types. The other one here, here's a sparse vegetation with litter, sparse live vegetation with litter and bare ground dominant. These are transitions that are driven by rainfall. The lupins dominant, that's another one that's dominated by rainfall. None of these transitions are driven by livestock grazing. These are grazed sites with different levels of livestock grazing, but the the transitions are primarily driven by weather. Another driver of transitions can be fire. In this case, we didn't have fire. So each of these transitions in the state and transition model has, we make this catalog of transitions. It's a long list. You can look at those and read them at your leisure, but I'll just try to point out one here. Lupins dominant to exotic grass dominant. This is an undesirable transition in relation to conservation goals. And we found that this transition was linked to high December rainfall. So that's a very unpredictable random event. Another one down here is we have T5, which is exotic grass dominance going to sparse live vegetation. We found that this transition was linked to a fire that had burned through the site in September 11th. So this presents a whole set of hypotheses and actual confirmation of states and transitions that are related to what is driving change in these systems. Here's the next couple of slides are going to be from Rancho Hamul. These were pictures that were taken earlier this, well, I guess it's still spring, this spring. So Rancho Hamul is grazed. It's a California Department of Fish and Wildlife Reserve that has grazing on it. You're going to hear from the person who grazes that. And it has some interesting small scale patterns, and these would be pasture level differences. And in this case, this is a pasture that's is grazed with using temporary electric fencing. It had been grazed prior to this picture being taken, and the patchy appearance, well, there's some shrubs in the foreground that are part of coastal scrub. But then in the background, there are individual purple needlegrass plants that are in that matrix. And so in this case, the grazing system was designed to remove and reduce the level of RDM so that native plants would be favored, and change the timing of grazing so that there was less pressure on the purple needlegrass. And so this is an interesting result that needs some study. Much of what we found in other locations on purple needlegrass is that it's the occurrence of the plant is very site dependent, in that there are typically soils that are slightly lower in fertility and have a different texture are the ones where you find these patches of purple needlegrass. But certainly this kind of grazing is a useful tool to try and to follow over time. Okay, some other things at Hamul. This is a different kind of site. This is a different soil. And it's a different ecological site. None of these ecological sites are named. They all have as placeholders the names of the old range sites. So these are typically shallow, loamy range site, which is not of sufficient detail to be able to allow us to predict what's going on individual pastures, or especially on smaller sites. So in this case, this is taken the same day as that other picture. The soil here is former cultivated area, so it has that history. It's shallower. This is good habitat for burrowing owls. So here in the background, there are some burrowing owl shelters. And so in the case of the first picture, that was one that could be thought of as requiring drivers to favor native grass abundance. In this case, it would be drivers that would reduce the amount of residual dry matter and make for more favorable burrowing owl habitat. That's been very successful at Hamul, which is now a center of burrowing owl diversity. Okay, now you're going to hear from another person, Matthew Shapiro, on grazing. So I'm not going to spend much detail on that, but I wanted to mention that the use of prescribed burning, there's a lot of values there. And when we talk about range management and grazing use, the provision of variable amounts of fuel, which would be ungrazed material, is a really important factor and becoming increasingly important in the way we manage individual pastures and ranch units. This is just an example of kind of work that's been done, which we've done on the use of prescribed fire for control of noxious plants. And so this case, this is in at the Nunes Ranch in the Bay Area, where the CDF was collaborating on this. And this is a burn. This is a spring, well, it's a late spring burn to reduce barbed goat grass, which is an important invasive, especially in Northern California. It's a very noxious plant. It has sharp spines on it. It's relatively indigestible, not good for range purposes. It also forms a thick thatch that is not good for even conservation or biodiversity purposes, but it's susceptible to being reduced by burning because the seeds are left on the plant a little longer than the other annuals. And so if you have a fire, you can burn it. And so there were repeated burns, which were successful in doing that. Excuse me. I'm not showing a slide of this, but Medusa head is also a grass that's invasive. It's very widespread in California and the West. And Medusa head Medusa head can be controlled with a similar kind of burn, and that's been a useful way to control Medusa head. That's been done at Hopland. I showed you a picture of that before, but also in other areas. We've used it successfully in coastal prairie at Point Pinhole, which is near on the San Francisco Bay. Here's another picture at Rancho Hamul. Rancho Hamul, only less than 2,000 acres are part of the grazed area. This is part of the grazed area, but it hadn't been grazed at the time of this picture. So there's an exclosure in the background. Those are useful as comparison sites. But in this case, even this year, there was sufficient for its growth to produce several thousand pounds. So this is the kind of thing that can create a fire hazard, especially as a point of ignition. For grassland fuels, and of course in the background there's shrubs. Grassland and shrub fuels, of course, are very different, require different management practices, but a mix of grazed grassland and shrublands should be something that could be targeted as a way to reduce the prevalence of wildfire, and it's going to be increasingly important, I think, in the past. So I'm just going to make a few summary comments. I hope this can lead to discussion later, but I just wanted to mention these. Biological diversity is dependent on spatial and temporal scale, and it's really useful for range managers to understand spatial and temporal scales, especially landscape, the landscape, pasture, and then pasture levels, landscape, ranch, and pasture levels. And then rangeland systems, I haven't said too much about this, but they are non-equilibrium type systems. And most of the factors affecting the amount of composition of vegetation are highly variable and not easily managed. The things that I went through in this talk are mainly factors that are physical controls, not grazing controls. That doesn't mean that grazing can't be a factor, but it's not the most important in most of these kinds of Mediterranean range types. And then grazing and productivity, effects on productivity and structure, are primarily through changing the amount, not type of biomass. And that's why we use residual dry matter as one of our keys to understanding the grazing influence. And then finally, ecological site descriptions and state transition models are useful framework for proposing, planning, and evaluating range monitoring. But for much of California, they're lacking. So, for example, there are none for the extreme coastal San Diego County. And we adapted to that at the Tajon Ranch by making our own, but there needs to, I think, be more of an effort to try to develop state and transition models. And that's one of the things that I think should be considered in looking at conservation issues in San Diego County. And here are some references. You can look at those at your leisure. That completes my talk.